Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's a Friday morning, middle of October. There's some frost on the pumpkin here in Minnesota. We got down to freezing last night. It's probably up to about near 40 now at 9:30 in the morning. Hope everybody's doing well. I appreciate you all for being a part of my life. It's been a fantastic summer as we move into fall, and of course, winter's near approaching. One of the things I want to share with you today is cleaning a record and the value of it and how it's done. And there's many different types out there. There's ultrasonic vibrations that rattle stuff out. There's some that will do 4 or 5 records at a time, spinning through the solution. The system I got as a gift from my good friend Ken Mikulev, the Maltese Falcon, as I call him. I don't know a lot of people from Malta. In fact, he's probably the only one I've ever met. But Ken's a great guy. He's a knowledgeable fella. He knows a lot about jazz and has met a lot of important people. He's got a very strong passion for audiophile and for sound. And he kept saying to me, you need to get a cleaner, you need to get a cleaner. Not because my record sounded bad, but it's something he believes in. And I'm always like, $500, $600, I'm going to put that on the records. I buy records, I'm a collector. And I can kind of clean things by myself, which I've always done. But he finally said, I'm going to buy myself a new record, update my record cleaner. I'm going to gift this one to you. And so he sends me a record cleaner. And I got to say, it has been a revelation in a lot of ways. It's kind of a joy, actually, doing the process. Feel like you're giving some rebirth to an old piece of vinyl, popping some of the mud, the dirt, the cracks, the oils out of the grooves. You can get rid of a lot of little hicks and bumps and little things, specks that'll make things skip. You can take old records and make them sound pretty good again. Even some surface scuffing, I find it'll kind of straighten some of that stuff out, even to a degree. Of course, deep marks are going to be deep marks, and nothing you can do about those. But I've definitely had some records that went from a pretty snap, crackly pop, Rice Krispie affair to a nice, smooth egg cream Danish once I was done. They sounded great. I've pretty much focused on only cleaning records from the early mid-50s, 10-inch stuff, maybe some early 60s stuff. I haven't really started even touching my 70s, 80s, 90s pressings. I did do a couple classic records before I did episodes on them, but those classic records are pretty well made, great reissues. So I'm just going to lower the camera here so you can kind of see the machine and how it operates. And there she is. Again, a big thank you to Ken for this fantastic gift. It's one of the nicest things anyone's given me in my adult life, without question. We're going to clean an old Kenny Drew record. Riverside puts out these 2 records on Judson, a small little subsidiary. Harold Arlen Showcase. Sorry, Harold Arlen Showcase. Kenny Drew. And then this is the other one, Harry Warren Showcase. And it's probably somewhat an answer to the Oscar Peterson stuff going on over at Verve. Let's have them do some kind of classical American songbook type titles. So you just take what's called, I think he called it the puck, off of there. And you spin that sucker back on there like so. And you take your solution, which is part alcohol, part just photographic solution that I'll put in the description what the solution is. It's something used for photographs. Kodak makes it. And then purified water, and the ratios are like 5% to 90% water. And you put that on there, it leaves a nice clean record, no filaments like some soaps would. I'm pretty generous with my distribution of the juice. I like to see the juice kind of bubble up and do its thing. There's actually some records that probably came from smoking homes where you can actually almost see the bubbles turn brownish from all the muck. And so it's always good to get that stuff out of the groove. So let's just show you how you turn it on, like so. Get one of these brushes, a lot of bristles in there. They're fairly rigid. You don't want to clean your teeth with them. And you just start working the groove. And there's probably different ways to go about this. Ken says you can bend the vinyl, which I've always usually kind of bend it a little bit. I try to put the bristles forward some, backwards some, forward some. I like to see those little bubbles forming on there. You know, I'm really kind of getting into the whole thing. And then you can change the direction, which I always do. And then you start to clean it the other way. And you kind of change the bristles back and forth. Each kind of a revolution. Hoping you're getting all the muck out. And then you lift up this arm. And you turn that on down there. And that vacuums out all of your collection. And then of course you turn this over and you access the other side. Reapply your favorite solution. Let it get in the grooves real good. Change the direction of the brush there. See how I'm doing that? Let it go one way. Let it go the other way. You feel like you can pop stuff out with different angles and stuff. At least I've always felt that way. Change the direction. Get it nice and lubed up. Put your vacuum on. And it sucks all the muck up. I take my vacuum off. I turn it back on. And I vacuum my brush out. I feel like vacuuming the brush out kind of keeps it cleaner. And the brush itself wasn't cheap. I think it was almost a $50 piece if I recall. So it's not cheap. So you gotta unscrew the top. And what you're left with is a piece of vinyl that's probably as clean as it's been in 60 years. It does make a significant difference. The old Judson label is kind of a cool one. I have to feel it's some kind of a play on the Hudson River. Judson, I'm not sure what exactly Bill Grauer and Keep News were thinking. I know they didn't run a very efficient ship when it comes to the financial aspect of things. So, cleaning records, it's a great way to extend the life of your LPs. You know, as a DJ, a lot of my records got a lot of fingerprints on them, and you get cocktails and some greasy food. And I'm pretty careful about cleaning my hands before I touch my vinyl. But sometimes you're in the middle of a gig, you got your food's out there, you're sticking some French fries in your mouth. You're like, oh shit, I need to change the record. And normally what I've done over the years is when I'm actually eating, I'll have a record playing with a kind of a longer track on it. Then I'll queue up a couple CD tracks or digital tracks on my laptop, and I'll mix into those while I'm eating. And then when I'm done eating, I'll wash my hands and then go back to playing the vinyl. I play probably 80% vinyl to about 20% off my laptop digital. The laptop has like 30,000 tracks in there. It allows me to have a lot of a library with me when I'm gigging, so I have the diversity to cover my needs no matter where a set might take me. But I try to play my vinyl and try to bring the vinyl I think is going to be applicable to whoever I'm playing that time. But you can only bring so much records, and I bring probably 200-300 vinyl, which is more than most cats will bring. I bring like 4 or 5 crates of records, which is quite a lot. But a lot of my gigs, it's hard to predict, you know. Some days you'll stay in a real funk soul vein. Other days you play a lot of jazz and blues and some down tempo. Some days you'll have a classic rock kind of crowd and they're singing along to Stuck in the Middle with You, you know, and Riders on the Storm. So you never really know exactly who your crowd's going to be. And also, often, who in the crowd feels like giving you energy. You know, a lot of times people will sit there and they're loving it, but they're not really expressing or showing. You know, you never know which table is the table that's going to respond with the big bright, oh yeah, we love this. Then you kind of feed that. You feed where the energy is coming from. And that's always been kind of a fun part of what I do. The other thing I want to dive in today a little bit is I want to give a little background into who I am. And I was talking with my friend Jean-Michel the other day, and I realized it was something I've kind of touched on a few times, so I probably figured I needed to kind of express a few things again and update a few things. Aside from being a DJ, I was born in Canada, in southern Ontario near Toronto. I was born in Toronto. We lived in a city called Guelph, which has actually become a pretty big city in and of itself nowadays. This is back in the 70s. We lived in southern Ontario, and my dad built pipe organs when I was a kid, and he installed them in the Baptist churches and black churches, and he wasn't doing cathedral level work because those are big ass organs, but he was doing some pretty impressive pipe organs all the same, and it kind of led him to the gospel, to the Lord and being born again, as they called it. And he met my mom, his wife, and they both became fairly evangelical Christians. And they're both first generation immigrants. They both came over from post-war Europe in the early 50s. My dad from Holland. Holland was liberated by the Canadians, and so a lot of Dutch people moved to Canada after the war. Relations were really good at that point. And of course the Brits can move to Canada anytime they want, being part of the Commonwealth at that point. So my dad's parents and my mom's parents both came over early 50s to Canada. My mom came from a more middle class, upper middle class probably background in England, and my dad came from more of a impoverished, almost peasant level existence. The war, of course, didn't help any of that situation for my dad's family, and so his older brothers came across first, and then he came across in I think 52 on a boat called the Grote Dam, the Grote Bear, which means the Great Bear. It's a Dutch word. He landed in Halifax on the eastern seaboard, and he takes a boxcar train across the frozen, Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec, New Brunswick, into Ontario. I think in Montreal they switched to a different train that might actually been heat there, but it was an unheated boxcar they traveled into Montreal, and they had literally their clothes on their back and like $5 to their name. And they got to southern Ontario where their older brothers had set up a farm, and they slowly started buying dairy cattle and becoming fairly big agrarian family with a huge spread diaspora of their own people. There was a fairly big Dutch community in southern Ontario, and they all had a lot of children, so they all had their own farms. And my dad went the different route. He went to the city and became a pipe organ builder and found the gospel, which led him to becoming a pastor, which led him to pick up the family and moving us to Manitoba, which is in the center of the North American continent. It's to the northwest of Lake Superior, the Great Lakes, former lake bed of a great post-glacial lake called Lake Agassiz. So it's one of the flattest places in the world, just flat. And the winter winds will sweep through and create these drifts. Manitoba was the frozen tundra compared to southern Ontario. Southern Ontario, we had grapevines, and it's similar to New York. It's a moderate climate. It's continental, but not like the extremes of being in the center of the continent like Manitoba. You have really, really cold, long winters, fairly far north, and then you have these really hot summers that when these storms would whip up across the prairie out of nowhere. It was quite the experience. We moved to south of Winnipeg to an area that was populated by Mennonites. And you think of the Amish, which is a sect of Mennonites, but there's many different sects to the Amish faith, the Amish tradition. These people were mostly coming from the Ukraine, from Russia, from Belarus, from Germany, Poland. They were Lithuanians. They came over after the First World War. The Bolshevik Revolution had happened. The Canadian continental vastness between the West Coast and Ontario, it's this huge open farmland. And there was this concern with American expansionism, the American motif of from sea to shining sea, manifest destiny. They had every intention of going all the way north to the Arctic Ocean. And so we needed to populate those plains with people in Canada, and we offered farmland to destitute Eastern Europeans for next to nothing. And these same people were also going to Chicago at this time, and earlier than that even in Chicago. But Germans, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, that whole group The Slavic descendants were all moving to southern Manitoba, and a lot of them came with their old world traditions, old world religions, a very conservative, traditional sense of values, families. They would make their own clothes. They would have farms with their barn attached to their home for the heat from the cattle because of cold prairie nights. A lot of these house barns were still there from the 1920s when they were built. We came from Toronto, big city. My parents were evangelical. As holy roller as you can get, my parents were that. And these people were far from that. They were very traditional, very old-fashioned. There ended up being a power struggle in the church my dad took on. Some rumors spread about my dad that were far from true. But in a small town, they closed us off. And we became essentially the cult leader family. And I would go to school, and not only would I get teased, but I'd get chased around. I would get beat up almost every day. I was scared to go to school at times. My mom don't make me go. Let me stay home with my dog, lay in my bed. I'd missed 30, 40 days of school, a couple years, grade 6, grade 7, into grade 8. Probably not so much grade 8. But it was a tough stretch being bullied every day, having the shit kicked out of me. They'd have 4 guys holding me down so gals could spit on my face. It was tough, and these were Mennonite people who are good people. Very noble people, very honest. But once rumors spread and once they closed their fences to us, they turned on us, and we weren't part of their community, and rumors spread really fast, and it was really a very uncomfortable scene. My dad couldn't find work, so we really dealt with some poverty where we had pancakes and water from a well, sometimes for a week solid. We'd have a can of peaches one day to put on our pancakes, and that was luxury. We relied on friends from the church to once in a while stop by with a bushel of groceries to help feed us, because they knew my parents were good people in spite of what was being said, and they knew they had 4 young boys that were hungry and needed to be fed. I remember going down the hill to this old hand pump water well in the middle of the winter and keeping that sucker pumping water and bringing it up to the house and heating it up. Our heat being turned off, having to cut wood and stuff. We lived very much a primitive pioneer type lifestyle, and this went on for probably about a year and a half. Things were tough. School was, I didn't want to go. I started lifting weights in 7th grade. 8th grade, I started lifting even more weights, and we ended up moving about 12 miles east to a town called Winkler, south of Winkler, into all these Mennonite villages. Schanzenfeld, Gorditz, Rheinfeld, Rhineland, Ostervik, real German names, German people. And I kind of turned my back on my parents, which what preacher kids do. This new town kind of accepted my dad. He got a job at a construction carpentry job. He was a good carpenter from being a pipe organ builder, and we slowly started to fit in, and things got better. But that whole time of my life has shaped my life immensely. And while my mom was forcing me to read the Bible, I was forcing myself to open up an atlas every day and seek for my own truth. And I've always had my nose within the Bible, within the atlas, looking for understanding and comprehension. And I eventually moved away from the church completely and dove into geography and history very extensively. And I was very passionate. I was very interested in understanding purpose and meaning. And that was something I was really trying to get my grasp on. And it became apparent to me that a lot of my philosophies as I grew older, a lot of my belief systems were shaped by those 2 tough years. Who I was, my empathy for others, my condition of searching. It's kind of in that pain and that desperation, in that place of sorrow where your soul longs to find meaning and purpose. Why am I struggling through this? What is the point? And it really dug me into a lot of introspection, a lot of honest searching. And I've said this before, and it's not always easy. I've heard this a lot before I kind of really grasped it. Truth is not something that can ever be told to you. You don't seek answers. People can tell you their truth, and it's always very relative. The only way you can quantify truth is by seeking the questions. what are the right questions we should be asking? And it's from that viewpoint. Once we have the right questions, the answers become obvious. See what I'm saying? When you start asking the right questions, like, how do we stop global hunger? How do we stop world wars? How do we stop great injustice? And when you dive into that and you see the economic inequality, and you recognize how unequal things are distributed, and you recognize that the people who control the wealth are the same ones saying that the freedom of capitalism is a right you all deserve, they don't want to release their wealth. And I think it's why when I heard jazz and black music in general, I had a great empathy for it. And my best friend is a mixed fellow from Detroit, and we met back in 1994, 95, working at a job together. And I was already very passionate about music. I've been in metal bands and rock bands for 10 years at that point. He was also a musician, but more from a funk, Detroit house almost background. But we still both were passionate about music. And we could sit there and talk at work for 3 hours about music. And I'd be talking about Neil Young and Steely Dan, and he'd be talking about Janet Jackson and Prince. And slowly we cross-influenced each other. We'd go to my place to hang out, start listening to my records. At that point, I probably had 500 records already. We'd listen to old Beatles, old Stones, old Pink Floyd, old Sly Stone, old Miles Davis. And we would hear a lot of the music of the R&B world being sampled from a lot of these old records. It was really revealing to hear this old groundwork that was classic rock and R&B, and how it was so interwoven, the blues. And then, of course, the Beatles pushes me back. The Beatles are this ultimate bottleneck where everything before them is in their sound, and everything since them has Beatles in it. You know, so there's this bottleneck of all this history that comes together in what the Beatles do. And everything since them has some Beatles in them. They really do. And the Beatles opened my mind up to Ray Charles and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Willie Dixon and Muddy Waters and eventually Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And so I'm digging into all this various music. And my black friend Justin, he was always dropping off and saying, you know what? I heard this great song. You should check it out. It's called Cutie Pie. I don't know who did it, but I remember it. You should check that song out. So I would dig it out, find the vinyl, and bring it home and start playing it at my gigs and my sets. And I would slowly start transitioning my sets more and more to R&B because it was great party music. And next thing you know, I had a large black following. And that slowly happens over the course of 2003 into about 2010, where I was playing for largely a black audience by then. And that furthered my empathy for the black experience. And during this whole process in the early 2000s, my jazz collection was growing. And I'm hearing the message of Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye, and R&B and soul, and I'm hearing the message of hip-hop. You know, back in the early 90s, I'm listening to Tupac and Dr. Dre smoking crack with buddies in the crack house down in Tennessee, you know. So I heard all these stories, and then it was just so obvious to me that the struggle and the pain that these people lived in today transcended into their lives back then, and jazz was saying a lot of that same stuff. And so I just want people to hear that history, to know that my time of struggle, which oddly enough you look back on now and all you remember is the good times, even from that. You know, collecting firewood and making a fire, and me and my brothers sitting around the fire, that's a good memory for me. You know, collecting my little hockey cards and sitting in the basement waiting for Hockey Night in Canada to come on, that's a good memory for me. You know, and there's nothing like being in a cold Manitoba winter with the wind howling and whistling and the snow drifting up in front of the house, and you got a fire going and crackling in the house, and you're sitting there with your brothers and your parents, and you're surviving, and that unity brings a resolution. You feel some strength in that, and that had to be the truth. And my biblical understanding also told me that was how the children of Israel survived. Unity, working together, finding solidarity against a common enemy and resolve. And the black community was that same reference point. So for me, very much, my own personal experience, my own persecution, if you will, is what opened my soul to hearing and understanding the struggle of others. And being able to codify and quantify that is what this is speaking about. A lot of my songwriting over the years, and I've been a musician for most of my life, was fueled by my pain, my sorrow. And a broken heart can do one thing, but feeling scared to live in the society you're a part of, that's a different type of sorrow. You know, being scared to go to school will make you write some lyrics at night. You know, make you write some songs down, some poetry, and just notebooks filled with stuff, which I wish I still had some of that stuff. You know, a lot of it's, who knows, but I've moved around so much over the years that none of that childhood songwriting remains. But I got songs that go back to the early 90s from those bands still in my collection. But, so my empathy is just not something that I just have a hunch. I've lived through some tough times. I've lived through some times that built my character and shaped who I am. And all the good times don't shape me nearly as much as those tough times did. And nothing proved that more to me than once we moved to Arizona with my metal band in '93. I was down there for about 8 months, a year before I left, went to Tennessee. My brother David stayed behind in Arizona, got married, and he went through the same thing I did, 1 year younger than me. And he also got, beat up and chased around and picked on and bullied. And we spent probably 5-6 years apart while he was starting a family in Arizona, and I was moving around the country still trying to be a rock musician. And then we both moved back to Minnesota, me probably 95 or 6, and he probably 97. And we hung out for the first time in years. And I wasn't super happy with him when I left Arizona, because I felt like his getting this girl pregnant and his relationship kind of was part of why our band broke up. But it was one of many things. Our band broke up for a lot of reasons. But it was funny because after years of not speaking hardly at all, we got together in a room, and so much of our philosophy, our belief systems, our understanding, our political stance, all was identical. We saw so many things in the same way, and his pain and sorrow made him seek and find some of the same answers that I found. And so again, truth is not something we can ever find by seeking answers. You just got to seek questions. Because I can give you a chalkboard filled with answers and say, tell me what the right answer is. And you better look at me and go, until you give me the question, I can't tell you what the right answer is. So truth is only found in seeking questions. And the right questions are, how do we make this world better for all of us? Because once we put aside race, nation, and religion and make a better planet for everyone to live on, we'll all have less crime, less poverty, less disease, less war to worry about. We'll have less taxation going into building weapons to kill our enemies if we distribute things differently and make it more solid for everyone to stand on. That's the bottom philosophy, and I think any fifth grader told how would you make the world a better place will come up with some form of that. Because the status quo will only remain as if we stay divided and if we stay ignorant, full of hate and full of fear. And no man is my enemy, no man am I afraid of. And I fear some guy with deep pockets more than anything, because he doesn't even know half the machines he's pulling. He doesn't even know what he's up to half the time. But I just want to give the people a little bit of background. I've had a few people inquire. I was talking with my friend Jean-Michel Research Beethoven the other day, and Beethoven's like, that's exactly why you are who you are. And I've shared some of this before, but I figured it was time to give people a bit of more insight into who I am. Having been an outsider, having been someone that was definitely not part of the community I was living in. And these Mennonites lived in a 100 square mile area where it was largely Mennonite people. People often said that they were 25 years behind the times. So this was 1980, 1985, and it was 1950s, 1960s there in a lot of ways, with their old school traditional values. A lot of houses didn't have electricity yet. The way they were very communal with their butcher shops and dairy barns, and they would trade and barter. I'll give you a side of beef if you give me so much milk for the next 6 months. There's a lot of community in that sense. It's great if you're part of it, not so much if you're outside of it. There was another community around there also called the Hutterites, who were another kind of branch that was even more socialistic and communist in their form of living. They lived very much in tight-knit communities with no outside help whatsoever. The Mennonites had a wide range, from being still in the bonnets and the traditional dresses, making their own clothing, to some that had been completely modernized and were fitting in. And the bigger the town you lived in, the more modern they became. If you were still part of the smaller villages out in the hinterlands, those people usually stayed very traditional. But even there was a pretty good mix of kind of modernized and real old world still. But the Hutterites, they were very much a communist society. And I remember my parents being evangelical and having been taught by Pat Robertson and all the Christians that communism hates God, that this community that was socialized and sharing and working together, which made sense to my young mind, they had to demonize that. Because in some ways that was communist what they were doing, and they hate God, which was ridiculous because the Hutterites were as religious a group of people as there was. Very traditional, very conservative in their values. Family mattered, and you all stuck by each other, and you helped build barns together, and it was a very traditional sense. So it was weird to be ostracized and the victim of a group of people who themselves were a group that was outside and often victimized themselves. You see what I'm saying? And eventually, like, we worked through it, and I became human to them, and they became human to me, and I have some good friends from that time frame. I don't really talk to too many of them too often anymore, but at the time, by the time I was a junior, senior, I had a lot of good friends, you know, and I turned things around. 10th, 11th, 12th grade, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and me, we were doing just fine. I grew my hair out and started the metal band, and next thing I knew, we moved to the United States in 1990. We moved down to North Dakota, right across the border from Manitoba, and moving to America was interesting in its own self, because everything you think America is, it's not. It's so different than how you perceive it in the media. It's, you know, from my parents' perspective, it was this God-loving, Christian, conservative, Ronald Reagan, America the Great, the Beautiful, the Peace in the Valley, all beautiful sympathy, empathy, you know, harmony, and boy, America's far from that. And Canada, with its socialist values, to my parents' understanding, actually has a far higher degree of empathy and sympathy for other groups. America's still a very divided place. And living here for 30 years now, I've seen and been shocked by a lot of what America truly is. And so that's where a lot of my insight comes from. A guy who spent the first 17 years of his life in Canada, going through some struggles, coming to America, and then seeing that struggle still play out here. And then the music I started to listen to and grew into revealed all of that. It just screamed at me. It's just like, wow, these guys got something to say. And they're compelled to do it because it's the only way they can calm their daily existence. And I know how that feels. Even when COVID first started, I started playing my guitar again every day just to calm, soothe myself, put my soul into that instrument and placate my nervous tension. And black music has always been that in America, up until probably the last generation or so, where the commercialization has taken over. You know, it's no longer black music being made by black people for black people. It's now black music being made for white people. And it's changed the soul of it. It's changed the commercialization of it. It sells shoes, cars, and wristwatches nowadays, which is a sad indictment. But anyway, I want to give you people a little bit of insight into who I am and where I come from.